more after effects of all this is the Enola Gay controversy, the bomber that dropped the bomb in Hiroshima. They wanted for the 50th anniversary to exhibit it at the Smithsonian Institute. And this led to a whole great deal of controversy because of a huge debate on how it was going to be, because they weren't going to just display it without comment. They were going to talk about, the decision to use the bomb, what, the after effects of it, and so on and so forth. And there was a great deal of debate. How much are you talking about just all the horrors that the civilians experienced? Why aren't you talking more about, the lives that were saved and so on and so forth? The whole thing ended up being such a controversial mess. Repeatedly trying to redesign the exhibit. Nobody was really happy. They ended up just canceling it and finally just exhibiting the fuselage without any comment, really, other than saying what it was. No background information, really. The director resigned. The director of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum resigned from the whole mess. Since it's gone on display, there have been attempts to vandalize it, or usually symbolic type of stuff, people throwing ashes on it and so forth, because it's a symbol of the evil atomic behavior that occurred. For further reading, there's a lot that you can read. I would say the most important thing on this is the most important thing with reading on the topic of the end of World War II is about stuff written, for the most part, after the early 1990s. The Soviet Union ended in 1991, the end of the Cold War. That opened up a lot of new resources. Emperor Hirohito, who was the emperor during World War II, died in 1989. His death opened up a lot of new Japanese sources that were kind of closed up because they didn't want to, expose him to criticism. They didn't want to have him looked at, because they viewed him so highly. They didn't want him to be an object of close scrutiny. So there's a lot of information about his role that came out after his death. You have Downfall, which I would say if you read only one book, Downfall would be my recommendation, from the late 90s, about basically the whole situation at the end of the war that I've tried to cover here today. You have a book that sort of disagrees with Downfall, Racing the Enemy, by a Japanese author. We unfortunately do not have that one here in the library system. It goes into a lot of detail on the day-to-day discussions with the cabinet, the Japanese decisions to prolong the war surrender. He kind of disagrees with Frank. Frank is of a similar mindset to what I've tried to present here today, that it probably was the right decision to use the bombs, that they did hasten the end of the war and were significant in ending the war. Hasegawa pretty much disagrees, that he feels that the Soviets, that loss of a diplomatic option would have ended the war. A follow-up book we have an American author and a Japanese author, and now we have Max Hastings, who's a World War II specialist, chiming in with a British author perspective. He has a book that basically covers the last year of the war against Japan and all facets of it, down to what the Australians were doing. He basically disagrees with, these books are stacked about 5 years apart in publication, so each one responds to the one before it, and Hastings more or less disagrees with Hasegawa, agrees with Frank as far as the importance of the bombs and so forth. One of the few pre-1990 books that's particularly useful is a book called August Storm by an author named David Glantz. That's about the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. I don't know how he got a lot of good sources for a in-depth military study of that operation in the early 80s, but it's supposed to be very good. David McCullough is an excellent author. He has a biography on Truman that's very well regarded. It did come out in the early 90s, so he doesn't have access to some of the sources that these other guys did, but he gives a very good overall view of Truman as a person and his mindset and so forth. The gentleman who was the Smithsonian director that I mentioned, Martin Harwood, after he resigned because of the whole mess with exhibiting the Enola Gay, he went on to write a book about all that. I don't know how, I haven't read it myself, so I'm not sure how biased he may be, or how well he presents it, but potentially interesting. And I've got a few other books up here that we have, mostly from the library. John Hersey has a very interesting book of people who had actually experienced Hiroshima firsthand and were survivors that he originally was published in 1946 in New Yorker magazine and then put together as a very famous book on people's experiences. There's also a fairly recent book called The Last Train from Hiroshima, which was sort of its own little news article a few years ago when it came out. It was supposed to be the experiences predominantly of people. There were several people who were in Hiroshima when the bomb went off, and they went home to Nagasaki in time for catching a second bomb. He writes about several of those and various other people relating to the use of the atomic bombs. The book came into some controversy and was actually revoked by the publisher, who refused to print it anymore when it became apparent that there was a certain amount of fabrication or dubious research. So it may be an interesting read, but maybe some of it's more on the side of fiction than fact. Two other books I have up here, which are sort of loosely related to our topic today, are books on the First and Second World Wars by an author named John Keegan. John Keegan's a very famous British military historian. I mention him because he unfortunately passed away this past weekend. While his books at times needed a little better editing on minor tactical and factual bits, as far as a big strategic picture of the wars and their causes and their operations, he's probably one of the finest strategic minds writing that wrote on military history during the last century. So if you haven't read those books on the First and Second World War, I definitely recommend them. That is going to be all for today's presentation. My next presentation will be on the 150th anniversary of Antietam next month. Same bat time, same bat channel as all the previous ones. Does anybody have any questions related to our topic today with World War II?
Yeah, I've read or heard somewhere that we dropped the 2 atomic bombs on those 2 cities, that it would have been 2 or 3 months before we could drop a bomb on another city because we only had the 2.
Yeah, I don't remember. I'm not sure how. I don't know if it was necessarily months. There was actually going to be 8 bombs available by November 1st, was their estimate. I think the next bomb was going to be available sometime later in August. I don't know exactly when. Another question over here.
I thought I heard the name Curtis LeMay.
Curtis LeMay,
but I never heard General Short.
General Short. Can't say.
That was Pearl Harbor.
He was one of the generals in command of the army at Pearl Harbor.
Okay.
He was Oppenheimer's boss.
Okay. I'm not too familiar with him, really.
And also, Truman was really kept in the dark until Roosevelt died, and then he was brought in.
Yes. FDR was a bit of a secretive person as president, particularly with his vice presidents, which he, in 4 terms, he went through 3 of them, Truman being the last one. And to add to that secrecy issue, Truman became vice president in January of 1945. At that point, FDR's health was really on a nosedive. He was at Yalta in February, and in the photos he clearly looks kind of weak, and a lot of people who were at Yalta, noticed that he was really not in good shape. And he would die in April of that year, and so he was, so FDR was basically in bad health the entire time that Truman was vice president, and so even if he was of the kind of person to share many details with him, which he wasn't, he wouldn't really have a lot of chance to. So Truman becomes president and has all this thrust upon him, and there's some debate on how well Truman handled it. Obviously, you're being thrust into the fire with. Truman had a decent resume and has gone down over time as a fairly good president. When he left office, he was not regarded very well. History has been fairly kind to him for the most part, and he's aged well in the eyes of historians. There's the mindset maybe he was kind of rushing and being aggressive in certain decisions after he came to power to try to look strong when he was in kind of a weak position from being so poorly informed. But he really did try his best to pick up all this information. And yeah, Basically, shortly after becoming president, one of his military aides had to pull him aside and go, we need to talk about something we've been developing for a few years we couldn't mention before. So he did not have as much time perhaps to decide as would have been nice, but had FDR been president, I don't think he would have hesitated at all to use the bombs. He had given them the okay, years earlier in his presidency, and he had no more reason than Truman to hold back.
There's so many revisionists after every battle, after every war, and the Enola Gay, of course, brings that out. I mean, you ask any veterans who were stationed in the Pacific what they would have wanted. They wanted the war over because they were going to be fighting in Japan. So
Yeah.
these revisionists who are sitting in their living rooms looking at a picture, but they do that after everything. There's always a revisionist.
There's always debate on a lot of issues. The Civil War, 150th brings up a lot of that too, but probably the atomic bomb is probably one of the most controversial ones. And yeah, just about anyone who you talk to that was a veteran that was looking to the probability of invading Japan, and if they had to choose between dropping that bomb, they were going to green light it. One of the books I have up here, it's from the FAU library. It's a book called Hell to Pay, a fairly recent book. The book, coincidentally, looks like it's had Hell to Pay. The author goes into probably the most in-depth study I've ever seen on just all the plans for Operations Olympic and Coronet. All the planning, all the details that were, everything down to how they were planning to deal with medical supplies and blood transfusions. He includes in there an appendix of a letter that James Michener, the author, who was serving in World War II, a letter he had sent but had requested, stemming from the Enola Gay controversy with the Smithsonian. He had sent the letter, but because of his situation, didn't want it to be published during his lifetime, and he is now dead. And basically, he was one among those chiming in on the side of, yeah, as a veteran who was possibly going to be hitting the beach as myself, I think it was the right decision to drop the bombs. I was working my way back first.
I was curious, I never heard, I live near, in Kentucky, near Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and several of the men from our town went down there to work, and they'd come home on weekends, and of course said they didn't know what they were doing. But I'm curious about the compilation of those three locations and the pieces to get the bomb in the plane, and where did the plane originate, when they decided to send it over there?
I think they actually might have sent them in the different parts in pieces over there and actually assembled the final assembly in the Mariana Islands on Tinian and Saipan, where they were flying the B-29s out of. If anybody's ever heard of the USS Indianapolis,
That's what the broad was brought.
Yeah, famous cruiser that was had shipped in secret, transported the bomb parts over to the Marianas. On the way back, because the mission was so secret, very few people knew it was even there. It was, stumbled across a Japanese submarine that torpedoed it. Because no one knew it was there, nobody noticed it was missing for some time, and it dumped a lot of sailors in shark-infested waters, and a lot of them died.
That was on the Ken Burns program.
It's a bit of famous. Even Jaws. If you've seen the movie Jaws, Robert Shaw's character talks about himself being a survivor of that, and probably one of the largest numbers of shark attacks on a sinking, just because they happen to be in the ocean and they flock to it.
Josh, I have a question.
Let me work my way around here.
Go ahead.
As far as the time that Japanese have warning this devastation before the atomic bomb?
They didn't have specific warning, that we didn't say we're going to drop an atomic bomb on you.
No, not necessarily.
They did. They did in the
we need to get something done because we have something that's going to.
In part of the wording in the Potsdam Declaration, which was issued at the Potsdam Conference a few weeks before the atomic bombs, did promise, I forget the exact wording, but essentially a ruin of unprecedented devastation on the Japanese if their leaders would not surrender. So they, without directly referring to the atomic bomb, they did try to hint at it, but it's whether or not that was taken as any serious warning by the Japanese, I mean, they put out a warning of some sort, and yes. There, gentleman right in.
Me?
Yes.
Me, my name's, no, I don't know how much truth there is to it. But I've heard that there was an awful lot of Japanese that were thankful that we dropped the bomb because they were going to be in that. They were going to be a soldier, and they knew they weren't going to survive.
Yeah, I haven't read myself too much about that, but I wouldn't necessarily be surprised that there were a lot of Japanese, especially civilians, who were glad that the war ended somehow because, you know, they were being conscripted, they were being trained to more or less sacrifice themselves to kill some Americans, and yeah, the war ending, you know, well, they didn't necessarily be happy about how it happened, but they were, you know, I mentioned the willingness to sacrifice 20 million. I doubt that was necessarily quoted to the Japanese people, but you're being trained to, you know, throw yourself with a landmine under a tank. You know your survival chances are 0. Other question?
Yes, so sort of basic, I realized. If Tokyo was firebombed,